Chapter 1. It was April, and Samuel Baker was preparing for an important examination. As the date of the exam drew closer, he decided he needed a secluded place to study. He didn't want the distractions of the seaside or the allure of the countryside. Instead, he sought out a quiet, unassuming little town where he could work undisturbed. He packed his suitcases with clothes and books, then searched a railway timetable for a town he had never visited. He found one and bought a ticket, telling no one where he was going. He wanted absolute solitude. That's how Samuel arrived in Ravenswood, a market town that bustled only once a week for a few hours. The rest of the time, it was a sleepy, tranquil place. Samuel spent his first night at the only hotel in town. The landlady, Mrs. Green, was kind and helpful, but the hotel wasn't quite enough for him. The next day, he began searching for a house to rent. There was only one place that caught his interest. It was not just quiet, it was deserted and eerie. A grand old 17th-century mansion with tiny, prison-like windows and a high brick wall surrounding it. It was hard to imagine a more unwelcoming place, but it suited Samuel perfectly. He sought out the local lawyer, Mr. Carter, who was responsible for the house. Mr. Carter was delighted to rent the house to him. "I'm glad to let you have it for free," Mr. Carter said. "Just to have somebody living in it again after all these years. It's been empty so long that people have spread a lot of foolish stories about it. You'll be able to prove those stories wrong." Samuel didn't feel the need to ask for more details about these foolish stories. He paid his rent, and Mr. Carter provided the name of an old servant to look after him. Samuel left the lawyer's office with the keys to the house in his pocket. He then returned to Mrs. Green at the hotel. "I'm renting a house for a few weeks," he said. "Can you advise me about shopping, please? What do you think I'll need?" "Where are you going to stay, sir?" the landlady asked. When Samuel told her, she threw up her hands in horror. "Not the judge's house," she exclaimed, growing pale as she spoke. He asked her to tell him more about the house. "Why is it called the judge's house?" he inquired. "And why doesn't anyone want to live in it?" Chapter 2. "Well, sir," Mrs. Green began, "a long time ago, no one knows exactly how long, a judge lived there. He was a hard, cruel man, a real hanging judge. He showed no mercy to anyone. As for the house itself, I can't say. I've often asked, but nobody could tell me for certain." She found it hard to explain the general feeling in the town that there was something strange about the judge's house. "As for me, sir," she said, "I wouldn't stay there alone, not for all the money in the bank." She apologized for worrying him, but Samuel reassured her. "I'm studying for an important exam, Mrs. Green. I have no time for horrors or mysteries." The landlady kindly promised to do his shopping for him. Samuel then went to see the old servant Mr. Carter had recommended. Her name was Mrs. Blackwell, and she seemed pleasant and eager to please her new master. When Samuel returned with Mrs. Blackwell to the judge's house 2 hours later, they found Mrs. Green waiting outside with several people. Men and boys carrying parcels and another 2 men with a bed. "But there are beds in the house," Samuel said, surprised. "And nobody has slept in them for 50 years or more," Mrs. Green replied. "No, sir, I won't let you risk your life in an old damp bed. The landlady was obviously curious to see the inside of the house, but was also clearly afraid. At the smallest noise, she held nervously to Samuel's arm as they explored the whole house. After his exploration, Samuel decided to live in the dining room. It was big enough for both working and sleeping. Mrs. Green and Mrs. Blackwell began to arrange everything. Soon, the baskets were unpacked, and Samuel saw that Mrs. Green had brought many good things from her own kitchen. Before she left, she turned to Samuel. "I do hope you'll be all right, sir, but I must say I couldn't sleep here with all those ghosts." When she left, Mrs. Blackwell laughed. "Ghosts?" she said. "There are no ghosts. There are rats and insects, and doors that need oiling. You'll see plenty of rats, sir, but no ghosts. Now you go and have a nice walk, sir, and when you come back, I'll have this room all ready for you." She kept her promise. When Samuel returned, he found the room clean and neat, a fire burning in the ancient fireplace, the lamp lit, and his supper ready on the table. "Good night, sir," she said. "I have to go now and get my husband's supper. I'll see you in the morning." "This is wonderful," Samuel said to himself as he ate Mrs. Blackwell's excellent food. When he had finished his supper, he pushed the dishes to the other end of the table, put more wood on the fire, and began to study. Chapter 3. Samuel worked without stopping until about 11 o'clock. Then he put more wood on the fire and made a pot of tea. He was enjoying himself immensely. The firelight danced on the old oak walls, casting strange shadows around the room. His tea tasted excellent, and there was nobody to disturb him. For the first time, he noticed how much noise the rats were making. "Were they making all this noise while I was studying?" he thought. "No, I don't think they were. Perhaps they were afraid of me at first. Now they've become braver and are running about as usual." How busy they were, and what a lot of noise they made. Up and down they rushed, behind the old oak walls, over the ceiling, and under the floor. Samuel remembered Mrs. Blackwell's words, "You'll see plenty of rats, but you won't see any ghosts." "Well," he said with a smile, "she was right about the rats anyway." He picked up the lamp and looked around the room. "How strange," he said to himself. "Why doesn't anybody want to live in this beautiful old house?" The oak walls were very beautiful. There were some old pictures on the walls, but they were covered with dust and dirt, and he couldn't see them clearly. Here and there, he saw small holes in the walls. From time to time, the curious face of a rat stared at him. Then, with a scratch and a squeak, it was gone. The thing that interested him most, however, was the rope of the great alarm bell on the roof. The rope hung down in a corner of the room on the right-hand side of the fireplace. He found a huge high-backed oak chair and pulled it up beside the fire. There he sat and drank his last cup of tea. Then he put more wood on the fire and sat down at the table again with his books. For a time, the rats disturbed him with their scratching and squeaking, but he got used to the noise and soon forgot everything except his work. Suddenly, he looked up. Something had disturbed him, but he didn't know what it was. He sat up and listened. The room was silent. That was it. The noise of the rats had stopped. "That's what disturbed me," said Samuel with a smile. He looked around the room and saw an enormous rat. It was sitting on the great high-backed chair by the fire, staring at him with hatred in its small red eyes. Samuel picked up a book and pretended to throw it, but the rat didn't move. It showed its great white teeth angrily, and its cruel eyes shone mercilessly in the lamplight.
WHYU, kriet Samuel.
He picked up the poker from the fireplace and jumped up. Before he could hit the rat, however, it jumped to the floor with a squeak. It ran up the rope of the alarm bell and disappeared into the darkness. Strangely, the squeaks and scratches of the other rats in the walls began again. By this time, Samuel no longer felt like working. Outside the house, birds were singing. Soon it would be morning. He climbed into bed and immediately fell asleep. Chapter 4. He slept so deeply that he didn't hear Mrs. Blackwell come in. She dusted the room and made his breakfast, then woke him with a cup of tea. After breakfast, he put a book in his pocket and went out for a walk. On the way, he bought a few sandwiches. Then I won't have to stop for lunch, he said to himself. He found a pretty, quiet little park and spent most of the day there studying. On his way home, he called at the hotel to thank Mrs. Green for her kindness. She looked at him searchingly. "You must not work too hard, sir. You looked pale this morning. Too much studying isn't good for anyone. But tell me, sir, did you have a good night? Mrs. Blackwell told me you were still asleep when she went in." "Oh, I was all right," said Samuel with a smile. The ghosts haven't troubled me yet, but the rats had a party last night. There was one old devil with red eyes. He sat up on the chair by the fire and wouldn't move until I took up the poker." Mrs. Green's eyes widened. "The rats are the least of your worries, sir. But as long as you're comfortable, I suppose that's all that matters." Samuel smiled at her concern and left for the judge's house. He spent the evening in much the same way as the night before, though the rats seemed even bolder. Their incessant noise was beginning to get on his nerves. When he finally went to bed, he fell into a fitful sleep. Chapter 5. The next day followed a similar pattern. Samuel studied in the park and returned home to another night of studying amidst the noise of the rats. However, something felt different. The house seemed colder, and the shadows longer and darker. The grand high-backed chair by the fireplace seemed more prominent, almost as if it were waiting for someone. As he worked, he heard a faint, rhythmic sound that gradually grew louder. It was the creak of the alarm bell rope swinging back and forth. Samuel looked up and saw the enormous rat with red eyes sitting on the back of the chair again, watching him with malicious intent. He stood up, determined to get rid of the rat once and for all. He grabbed the poker and approached the chair. The rat didn't move. Samuel swung the poker, but the rat jumped to the floor and ran up the bell rope. As the rat disappeared into the darkness, the alarm bell let out a single ominous clang. Chapter 6. The sound echoed through the house, and Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He shook off the eerie feeling and returned to his books, but his concentration was broken. He kept glancing at the chair, expecting to see the rat reappear. The house felt more oppressive, as if it were closing in on him. Determined to get some sleep, Samuel went to bed early. He lay awake for hours, listening to the scratching and squeaking of the rats. Just as he was drifting off, he heard a new sound, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the stairs. His heart raced as the steps grew closer. He held his breath, waiting for the door to open, but it never did. The footsteps stopped just outside his room. Samuel stayed awake, too frightened to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. He got up and opened the door cautiously, but the hallway was empty. He went downstairs and found Mrs. Blackwell already at work. "You look like you didn't sleep well, sir," she said, handing him a cup of tea. "I heard footsteps on the stairs last night," Samuel said, trying to sound casual. "Did you hear anything?" Mrs. Blackwell shook her head. "No, sir. I didn't hear a thing. But this house has a way of playing tricks on people." Chapter 7. Samuel spent the day studying in the park again, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. When he returned to the judge's house that evening, he found a letter waiting for him. It was from Mr. Carter, the lawyer. "I hope you're settling in well," the letter read. "I wanted to let you know that the judge's house has a history of strange occurrences. The judge who lived there was known for his harsh sentences and his belief in the supernatural. Some say his spirit still haunts the place." Samuel read the letter twice, trying to process the information. He had come here for peace and quiet, but instead, he found himself in the middle of a mystery. He decided to confront his fears head-on. That night, he sat in the high-backed chair by the fire and waited. The rats scurried about, and the house creaked and groaned. Samuel stared at the bell rope, half expecting the red-eyed rat to appear. Midnight came and went, and still he sat there, determined to face whatever came his way. Chapter 8. Just as he was beginning to think the night would pass uneventfully, the room grew colder. The fire flickered and dimmed. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow and shift. Then he heard it, the creak of the alarm bell rope swinging back and forth. The red-eyed rat appeared, staring at him with malevolence. Samuel stood up, gripping the poker tightly. He watched as the rat ran up the bell rope, and the alarm bell let out a single deafening clang. Suddenly, the room was filled with a chilling presence. The air grew thick and oppressive, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. From the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the judge, his cruel eyes fixed on Samuel. The judge's spirit radiated an aura of malice and authority. Samuel could feel the weight of the judge's judgments, the suffering he had caused. "You dare to disturb my house?" The judge's voice was a cold whisper, echoing through the room. Samuel tried to speak, but no words came out. The judge moved closer, his eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. Samuel felt a wave of terror wash over him. He stumbled backward, tripping over the chair. As he fell, the judge's spirit loomed over him, a dark shadow blotting out the light. Chapter 9. Samuel woke up on the floor, the morning light streaming through the windows. He was drenched in sweat and trembling with fear. The room was empty, but the oppressive feeling lingered. He knew he couldn't stay in the judge's house any longer. It was not just a quiet place to study, it was a place of darkness and evil. He packed his belongings and left the house, never looking back. As he walked away, he could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. He knew he had to find a new place to study, somewhere far away from the judge's house and its haunting memories. Back in town, Mrs. Green and Mrs. Blackwell were waiting for him. They saw the fear in his eyes and knew something had happened. "You were right," Samuel said to them. "There is something in that house, something that should never be disturbed." Mrs. Green nodded solemnly. "The judge's house has claimed another victim," she said softly. "Let's hope it will be the last." Samuel found a new place to study, and though the memories of the judge's house haunted him for a long time, he eventually moved on. He passed his exams and went on to have a successful career. But he never forgot the chilling experience in the judge's house, and he never again sought solitude in such a place. Epilogue. Years later, Samuel returned to Ravenswood, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and a desire for closure. The judge's house still stood, as imposing and eerie as ever. The town had grown, and the stories about the house had become legends. Samuel stood outside the house, now overgrown with ivy and looking even more desolate. He wondered if the judge's spirit still haunted the place. As he turned to leave, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in one of the tiny prison-like windows. But when he looked again, it was gone. With a shiver, Samuel walked away, leaving the judge's house and its dark secrets behind. Some places, he realized, were better left undisturbed.